Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning for our Sunday morning service. I hope you're getting out and enjoying this beautiful fall weather. One thing that I really enjoy about San Jose is the weather. I cannot complain about the weather here. It never gets super hot, it never gets super cold, and if it does, it's for a couple of days. It's not months at a time. So I hope you're getting out to enjoy it. The leaves are starting to turn. It's just a beautiful time of year. Today is Communion Sunday, so if you would like, you can get your elements and take it with your family and just spend some time talking and thinking about what Jesus did for us and what that process of taking communion actually means. Other than that, our men's group is meeting on Monday nights at 6:30 here at the Father's house and on Zoom. So if you would like to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl, Pastor Carlos, or CR know and they'll get you set up for that. Our ladies group is meeting on Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom, and we're going to keep it on Zoom because we have some people that have moved out of the area that we want to stay involved with and that still want to stay involved with us. So again, that's 6:30 on Thursday nights on Zoom. If you want to be a part of it, let Deanne, Parodies, or myself know and would love to have you join us. Today is our regular tithes and offering. You know the drill. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, give a one-time gift or a recurring gift. You can give to our missions that way, and you can also give to our stage remodel, which we are getting pretty close on ordering some equipment so that we can get the camera set up and do a live stream event so that you in the outer areas or watch on the video can enjoy our worship team. Man, I tell you what, for National Back to Church Sunday, they rocked the house. So it was great to have them all performing and all worshiping God and just feel the spirit that they have as a group, and our family, our whole Father's House family got to be blessed by it. So anyway, you can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the local area and you would like Pastor Carl or I to come by and pick it up, we'd be happy to do that for you. I think that's all I have to cover today, so we'll turn the time over to Pastor Carl.
Well, good morning, Father's House. How are you today? I trust you're having a great day. Like Penny said, the weather's been absolutely beautiful, so I'm hoping that you've been out enjoying this weather, making the most of it, because it won't be long, and it'll be raining, and it'll start to get cold. So the falls around here are just an incredible time, like the springs are. The springs and the falls here in San Jose are just some of the best in the world as far as just that crisp air, but it doesn't get too cold. We get a little bit of the changing the colors of the trees. And so it's kind of a neat thing. Not like Southern California where I live down in Carlsbad, although that weather is arguably better than this, or in when we lived in San Juan Capistrano near Dana Point. Down there, there really is not a long winter. It kind of goes from fall back into spring. And so you get fall very late. Sometimes you don't get fall till November or December. And then by January, you're starting to warm back up a little bit and you're past through your winter. So I have to say I like those winters better than I do here. But I live here and this isn't bad, because if you've ever had winter in cold weather climate, you know that is even worse, or it can be treacherous at times. Anyway, I'm just hoping that you're enjoying your days, these beautiful fall days. So I want to talk to you again today, kind of continuing with what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Last week we talked on just love, because it was kind of an anomaly when we were thinking about the notion of National Baptist Church Sunday, and that was the theme that we wanted to talk with. So I want to circle back, and I want to talk about wisdom again. We've been talking out of Proverbs chapter 9. We've been talking about the 7 pillars of wisdom. And so we kind of worked through all of that text, and the last one basically that is kind of talked about there, which is interesting, is the last one mentioned in chapter 9. It's the first one mentioned in Proverbs 1, and that has to do with fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge or of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So we started talking about fear of the Lord as it relates to wisdom. Now, we talked about wisdom, and our conversation that we've had about wisdom going really back to the very beginning of this year. We've talked about wisdom in many different ways, and yet we find that it's somewhat hard to really give a clear, in focus definition as to what wisdom is. And I understand that. It's just, it's always going to be an out of focus concept. And that's what makes it so intriguing and interesting, because there's always things to learn, and there's always things for us to acquire and understand knowledge-wise, that kind of promotes in us a greater well of wisdom, if you'd have it. So, thinking about wisdom and defining wisdom, it's interesting to think about. There really are two types of wisdom, and this may help us bring it a little bit more into focus, so that we can kind of understand what is this that this Hebrew text in Proverbs is trying to tell us, and what is the New Testament as Christians, what's it trying to convey to us about this notion and idea of wisdom. Now, I mean, throughout the text, wisdom, in this text, in Proverbs, Lady Wisdom is very clear that you've got to seek for her as silver and as gold, and that wisdom isn't acquired easily, that it's something that's got to be sought after. And so when we talk about wisdom, whether it be natural wisdom or divine wisdom, is something that we ultimately have to seek after. So going back to trying to bring focus to this concept of wisdom, there's really kind of two types of wisdom. There's human wisdom, which is the wisdom that we can acquire as rational human animals by the use of our reason, our intellect, that we can reason different things. So, to give you an example of that, if you go really back to the Socratic philosophers, which would be Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and especially Aristotle developing and even through Aquinas, and Augustine to some extent as well, when talking about morality, and some others as well, that apart from Augustine and Aquinas, I guess I should leave them out of this equation because they were both predisposed to divine wisdom. But for Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, really their idea and their concept of wisdom came by way of the moral virtues of how one lives a life well lived regarding the virtues. So we talked about the idea of the practical virtues of fortitude or courage, temperance, self-control, prudence, right reasoning, and justice, giving the other what is their just due, or what is their rightful due. And so we talked about those, and those are all virtues that really are just, they can be reasoned by man to be able to understand, at least in some ways, what they are and how they work in a society when we're dealing with other people. So wisdom always isn't just wisdom for yourself, but wisdom is always conveyed by how we deal with other people. So in that instance, when you go and look at those four cardinal virtues, or other ones that Aristotle really, for the most part, developed, virtue of generosity, of friendship, and such, the virtue of religion, then what you begin to see there's, in this rational mind, there's this wisdom that comes from man, because God made us as creatures to where we can reason about those things. So that's the type of wisdom that we can find as a natural wisdom. But when we're talking about here in the book of Proverbs, or when we're talking about Christian wisdom, then we're talking about a wisdom that's divinely infused by God. In other words, it comes from God. So where rational, practical wisdom, natural wisdom on the part of man can be reasoned within himself, what Scripture's teaching is here is that fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so it's turning it on its head and saying, yeah, that's true that it can be reasoned, but for the Christian, or for the Jewish person following Judaism, what would basically be said is that there's a divine wisdom that's above that of rational wisdom. Now, why would that be? Well, that would be the case because human rational wisdom would have its limitations, wouldn't it? If you were to take this glass right here and you think about, you could fill this with human wisdom and maybe you can't get it all the way full, But, like let's say it's water and you just kind of keep filling it with water all of your life, you kind of keep going up. But divine wisdom, because it doesn't have a limit to it, would be like the ocean. So it would be like trying to take the ocean and filling this container with all of the water in the ocean. You wouldn't be able to do it. So it's the exact same way with the wisdom of God. God's wisdom is so far beyond us that we'll never attain all the wisdom as long as we live, because God is infinite and we are finite in that we have a beginning and we have a finite mind. Now, that doesn't mean that after this life that we're not going to grow in wisdom and knowledge. I would think we're going to as we kind of progress on this journey that God's taking us on. But the idea is we're still ultimately finite, and God is the one that is infinite. So in the book of Proverbs and in our Christian understanding as well of wisdom, wisdom or true wisdom starts with the divine, or with divine wisdom. Now, that's not to say that practical wisdom isn't important and you just brush it to the side. That's not true. And I don't want to convey that that would be true. As a matter of fact, I think in some cases Aquinas would think, Aristotle would think, although Aristotle wasn't a believer in God in the way that we are, but let's talk about Aquinas. Aquinas would kind of basically be saying, well, you really can't understand divine wisdom until you understand practical wisdom. That becomes your building block to understanding the divine. In any case, though, when we're talking about divine wisdom, and that's what we're talking about here today when we're looking at Proverbs or when we're looking at the New Testament, that divine wisdom and what Scripture says here is that the starting point for divine wisdom is fear of the Lord. That's the starting point. That's what they would call the first principle of wisdom. The same way you talk about in logic, there's 4 first principles. There's a law of identity. There's a law of non-contradiction, or the principle of contradiction. There is the principle of the excluded middle, and there's the principle of sufficient reason. All of logic is built off of those 4 principles. They are the starting point for how we logically think. Now, I understand that what I just said you probably won't understand unless you've had a course in logic, and even if you did have a course in logic, you probably forgot those because you will forget them, but those are the starting points for logic. So what this text is saying is it's saying that our starting point for true divine wisdom, godly wisdom, begins with this notion of fear of the Lord. We talked 2 weeks about fear of the Lord, and what we said about fear of the Lord was that it's this awful respect of God, that we're in awe of God, and there comes with it this healthy dose of respect. And I've thought about, all through the years, whenever I read that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, whenever I thought about that, I always wondered why the translators didn't change it to awe or respect or profound respect, because they certainly could have used other words to convey the same meaning, that they always stuck with this notion of fear. And I think that rightfully so, they did. And I wouldn't have thought this maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I would have argued that that was a bad word to use. But the more I've thought about it and the more I've matured, I began to realize that they used a lot of wisdom in using that word fear as opposed to using a different word. The reason that I think that that's important is because it does make God otherly. It makes him different from us, distinct from us. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. So we always want to make God, in some cases, in our image. So we kind of talk about, 2 weeks ago, I kind of talked about this, where, you kind of talk about, well, that's not my God. My God wouldn't do that. And so we make this image of God and we say, well, God's got to live within my image. But God's saying, no, you've got that wrong. I am who I am, and I will be who I will be. And I'm not going to conform to how you want me to be, because I am who I am in my perfect wisdom. And so the idea then is, when we understand fear of the Lord, we change our relationship to kind of this idea of what we can get from God, how God can benefit me, how God changes me. It switches to, like, we're kind of saying, when we look at God, of, I really don't understand you, but the thing is, it's not so much about me, it's about you. And that right relationship with God starts with us being people that are humble, that have this sense of awe and deep respect for God. So what he's saying, and what wisdom, Lady Wisdom is saying here, is that's the true beginning of wisdom in the divine sense. And so that's and the thing is you read through the book of Proverbs and in Psalms and other places, fear of the Lord is a big theme all the way through this. We're going to talk more about it, but it's a big theme all the way through this book of Proverbs. So the idea then of fear of the Lord, it has to do with the notion of this awe and respect for God, realizing that God's other than we are. He's holy, completely holy. And it is our responsibility to begin to understand him, because as we begin to understand him, then what happens is we become like him, and then we act like him. So fear of the Lord is that which separates God from us. It puts us in a place of humility. The second thing that it does is when we do that, we now are in a proper attitude where we can learn. Before that, without humility, it's hard for any of us to learn, isn't it? Well, because we think we know it all. In my life, I've had to be humbled many, many times because I have a tendency to think I'm a know-it-all. I'm sure that maybe that might strike some of you as odd, but I'm sure that there's a lot of other people that relate to what it is that I'm saying. So the idea, though, is that fear of the Lord puts us in a right relationship to understand wisdom, because we understand God is greater than us. His concepts are greater than our concepts. His notions are greater than our notions. His laws are above and beyond our laws, and yet they apply directly to us and how we treat other people. It starts with that. The second thing, I want to read this text about wisdom because it kind of conveys the second part of that, and that is that knowledge of God is understanding. In other words, it's fearing God, starting from a position of humility, and then beginning to understand God, because we're in a teachable moment to where God can then begin to divinely reveal to us what wisdom is. So this text is just fun. All of these texts in the first 9 chapters of Proverbs is a wonder to read. I can't hardly get out of these books sometimes because I just love the way that Solomon wrote it. But in chapter 2, this is how it reads. My son, hear what he says. My son, if you will receive my words and treasure my commandments within you, make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart to understanding. For if you cry for discernment, now we talked about that right before, lift your voice for understanding. If you seek her, wisdom, as silver, and search for her, wisdom, as hidden treasures. Now, notice what he says in verse 5. Then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for those that are upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity and on his paths. So, again, it brings forward this idea of fear of the Lord. And it says that really in this, that as you begin to pursue wisdom and you seek for her as silver and as fine gold or hidden treasures, that what the first thing you do when you talk about divine wisdom is you begin to discern the difference between God and between you. Therefore, you don't get a say anymore or dictate how you think God should be. You can't say, well, my God wouldn't do that, or my God wouldn't act a certain way when you create him in your own image. The idea is that we start from and discern through the fear of the Lord. We turn it around to where we're basically in this position and posture where we say, I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to learn. You teach me about you. Give me knowledge about you that I might become wise. So in this instance, the difference between what we talked about before when we talked about natural, rational wisdom and the wisdom that we're talking about here is now we're talking about wisdom that's given divinely by God. And that's what this text is saying. So the idea is that now God becomes our teacher of wisdom rather than Aristotle or rather than Plato or Aquinas or other religious leaders. Now, and I'm not dismissing any of them because I think every one of them adds deeply and profoundly to this conversation that we're having today about wisdom. But what I'm saying is that God, even through them, can convey wisdom to us. And through other people, he can. But the idea is that our posture is to recognize that God is holy, that he's different than we are, and that our thinking comes into line with his thinking will become teachable, and starting with the idea or first principle of the fear of the Lord. I hope that makes sense so far. So the second thing about this text is it says, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Starts with fear, which implies humility. And the second part of that is that understanding is divine knowledge, or knowledge of who God is. Now, that becomes a pretty big question, doesn't it? And it becomes a big question because when you talk about trying to fill this little vase here with the ocean, you can't do that. And so the idea that we could ever, and how much we could know about God is limited and will always be limited. In the actual sense. I mean, with that, then it's kind of like you say, well, how do I get to understand and know who God is? And that becomes a big question. I mean, that's almost the question, is really the question of all of the different religions of the world, isn't it? I mean, Muslim, who's still a part of the Abrahamic faith, see God different than a Christian would. A Buddhist really doesn't have a concept of God in the same way that we do. A Hindu would have a concept or ideas of many gods, which would be polytheism, which is different from us. Heck, even within Christianity, a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness is going to see this idea of God through different lenses than what we're going to as evangelical or Protestant Christians, Roman Catholic, whatever. So we all okay, so we're asking ourselves the question is, okay, well then how do we get knowledge of the divine? How do we get this knowledge that he's talking about? Well, the first thing to be noticed here again is it says that God gives us wisdom. So God divinely reveals it to us when we're in a proper learning posture. But in saying that, there's some things that we can do in our pursuit of wisdom that helps us understand the divine better. And as a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ, then what we find as our model for that, or what we would call our exemplar cause, our model would be the person of Jesus Christ. In other words, he's the example of what divine wisdom is. Now you remember I think it was in John, it says that Jesus Christ was sent to explain the Father to us. So Jesus came, and his whole message was to explain the Father to us. So can you see how that begins to change our dynamic a little bit when we're talking again about God being otherly, Jesus Christ being this model that explains God to us, how Jesus then, for the Christian, becomes the connection for divine wisdom. So that means that for us, the first connection is this person of Jesus Christ, and more importantly now, Jesus Christ not being physically present to teach us, is the texts that are written about Jesus, the things that Jesus taught, the things that he said, the things that he did. And then from there, as God's given revelation to others about that, of how that applies to us understanding God. To have knowledge of God, so we have understanding of who he is, how he's different in a limited sense. But it becomes the basis for our wisdom. So if you think about it, with Jesus being this primary cause for us to understand wisdom, then the place that we would start to understand it, Jesus again being sent to explain the Father, would be for us to go into, I would start with the Gospels and start listening to the things that Jesus taught, listening to the things that Jesus that Jesus conveyed to others, and looking at the actions, because his actions show him or show the heart of God or the heart of the Father. So for us then as Christians, that's why the Bible becomes so primarily fundamental in our thinking. It becomes the foundation. So we've got this fear of God, but then we also are drawing from sacred texts that we believe to be inspired by God, so that we can understand more of the knowledge of who God is. Now, this isn't a knowledge that we get just so we can have knowledge for knowledge's sake. This has to do with the acquisition of wisdom so that we can treat others the way that God would have us treat them. We're moral creatures. We're communal creatures. We live amongst one another. And boy, you don't have to go very far into the day until you're going to find that somebody's going to be at odds with somebody. There's going to be yelling or screaming or road rage or whatever. And you can see in all of our society that sometimes we don't play well with each other. But the whole Christian message really has to do with not just our relationship with God, but it has to do with the way that we treat others, the way that we view the world. When we view the world through our own selfish means and ends type of thing, of what's in it for me, then we've missed the distinction of what it is to be truly wise. And so for us to be wise, there's a couple of things that we have to do to start that journey. Now that journey will go on the rest of your life. Make no mistake about it. You can become wiser and wiser every day of your life if you pursue wisdom. But the idea is if we don't pursue wisdom, we're not going to acquire any new wisdom. And many people stop short of what they can be and what they ought to be. So today, as we're kind of finishing and closing up this idea of fear of the Lord, if I was going to leave you with anything, I would leave you with a couple of different points. Number one, fear of the Lord begins with understanding that God doesn't think like us. God is not a man. God doesn't think like a man. He made us in his image and in his likeness, and he made us rational creatures so we can understand him. But make no mistake, God is not like man. And whenever we try to make God like man, we make God into an idol. Our job as Christians is not to make God into anything other than he is, but to understand him. That's the difference. And that starts with this place of being humble before him because we fear him. And the second thing is that we turn to Jesus Christ as our example and our model. And so because he's our example and our model, then it's up to us as Christians to study the life of Jesus Christ, to look at what he says in the Sermon on the Mount and see what he says through the rest of the texts that teach us the things of God and the way that God thinks. So if we begin with fear of God, we walk in humility or a teachable spirit, and then we look to Jesus as our model, then we are beginning this journey, these first principles of wisdom, this journey, this pilgrimage of becoming wise people. What it comes down to is whether or not we choose to. Whether you choose to participate in this journey or not is up to you. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm going to talk here, so you don't have to pursue maybe wisdom and knowledge every second of the day and never give yourself a break. But it's being committed to learning. It's being committed to understanding the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God. Because those are the things that change us. And way back at the beginning of this whole year that I've been talking about the virtues, and now the 7 pillars of wisdom, and the extraordinary life, which was sandwiched between those two things. We talked about this notion in Psalm 90, where it says, "Teach us, O Lord, to number our days, that we might present before you a heart of wisdom." When we stand before God, what we're going to be judged on is our wisdom. That's what the text is really kind of saying there. I'm not saying it in a negative sense. I'm saying that we've got this responsibility that if we want to become wise and we want to present it before God, it begins with fear of the Lord, which puts us in this humble relationship before him that makes us teachable. And we look to Jesus, who is the author and the perfecter of our faith, hope, and love. God bless you. I hope you'll say yes to this today, and I'll see you again next week.